90 because that's what you paid for it. However, building, I shouldn't say however, and building is worth twice as much as the land. You rely on the relative values of the individual assets in the appraisal report while simultaneously accepting that the appraiser might have boosted up the value of everything a little bit to make the numbers look better. Okay, next question. I buy an asset. I borrow money. The present value of what I'm paying is 70. So the asset is worth 70 and the liability is worth 70. Increase asset equipment by 70, increase note payable by 70. If an asset and a liability both go up by the same amount, assets minus liabilities do not change. Thus, there is no revenue or expense in this transaction. The only choice that is consistent with what I just said is the first one, increase equipment by 70. Next question. This has to do with donation of land. I'm sorry, donation of property, in this case, land. In this particular example, I am buying something for 10 million. It is an asset. It is land or property. Well, if it's McDonald's, you've got a building on that as well. In any event, I'm buying an asset worth 10. I'm paying cash worth 8. Well, who's paying the extra 2 million? Well, the city of Houston wants me to develop property to spread economic prosperity. So the city of Houston is basically donating it to me. Well, as far as I'm concerned, my asset, building, land, property, plant, and equipment, and it depends on what the problem says you're buying, but the asset's going up by 10. Cash is going down by 8. Well, if one asset goes up by 10 and another asset goes down by 8, then assets in total go up by 2. There's no change in liabilities, so assets minus liabilities or value goes up by 2. Value goes up by 2, that is revenue. So building is valued at 10, and we have revenue of 2. That's the second choice. The final line of a journal entry, if you're journal entry focused, is cash goes down by 8. Okay, last two questions are the whole oil and gas accounting successful efforts versus full cost method. Oil is discovered under UH. Who would have thought it? We pay $300 and we drill 3 holes. One is dry and the other 2 is successful. If you use the successful efforts method, then you say each hole is worth $100 if the hole is effective. If the hole is not effective and is dry, then it's worth nothing. 2 holes are effective, each are worth 100. The value of the oil deposit is therefore 2 times 100 or 200. That's the successful efforts method. On the other hand, you might say, no, as long as any of the holes are effective, then I'll be able to get the oil out of the ground. And it's really the oil that I'm buying. And so if I'm paying $300, doesn't matter if I drill 1 hole or 50. Doesn't matter how many of the holes are dry and how many strike oil. Assuming at least one of the strikes are successful and at least one is sufficient to actually get the oil out of the ground, then I paid $300 for the oil, and under the full cost method, the value is $300. In a way, it's a philosophical difference of opinion. But as is the case with all of accounting, it's sort of based in a foundation of pragmatic fact. because there are some people who say, fact, it's actually the holes or the drilled wells themselves that I think have the value. Other people say, that's not my fact. My fact is it's the oil that has value. Depending on where you think the value is, excuse me, based on the strategy of your company, would determine, usually determines the method you choose. If you're a fracker, fracking for oil in the Permian Basin, and if every hole that you drill requires all kinds of advanced technologies that you have developed for yourself, then you're probably more hole focused or well focused, and you'd probably be more inclined to use the successful efforts method. If, on the other hand, you're an old-fashioned classic oil and gas person, and you say that there's nothing new and noteworthy about the technology of the oil wells that I am drilling, I just try to find tried and true oil fields. And it's not the holes themselves that are noteworthy. I'm just trying to get to the oil under the ground. Those more old-fashioned companies tend to be full cost method oriented. Okay, that's just a little bit of additional detail to brighten your morning. Any questions about the quiz? Imran, go right ahead.
Could you just repeat on question two, what you're talking about? I kind of get it, but I just want to confirm it. So it's not increased notes payable by 100 because we had discounts for 30, basically. Is that why?
Exactly right. If if you buy something for 100 and you're going to pay it within a year, then there's usually no present value calculation because the present value of what you're paying in the very near future is what you're paying. Usually, when you're agreeing to pay something, but it's more than 1 year out, that's when you start to worry about and calculate present value. And that's when the present value, what something is worth today, is going to be somewhat less than what you will actually pay for it in the future. And so this is 3 years in the future. And so instead of saying the asset and the liability is what I will pay for it in the near future, instead you say the asset and the liability is what I will pay for it in the further out future, present valued back to its, or present valued down to its value today.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. As an additional side comment, always keep in mind accounting is always about value. What is something's value to me today? That's what I record. It's at the essence of the assets minus liabilities equal value, fundamental accounting equation. Chelsea, go right ahead.
Could you clarify question three? Why we're recording to the revenue account instead of like I thought maybe there was like a different like a sub account, like because it sounds the way the question's worded, like almost like UH is giving like they're receiving like a grant or something from Houston rather than actual like sales revenue.
Right. So I think the textbook calls it donation revenue, and in this case, we're using revenue in the same sense that we use that word in that very first class we took together when we looked at the data analytics approach to accounting for the first time, which is to say, anything that increases the value of the company is revenue. Any decrease in the value of the company is called expense. And so in this case, one asset is going up by 10, another asset is going down, but only by 8 because a third party is picking up the other two. Well, that means assets and therefore value of the company is going up by a net of 2, and we call an increase in the value of the company revenue.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, sure. There are so many people, who make it through 2301, and they work so hard, to memorize the debits and the credits and the journal entries. Then there are closing entries, and then in some classes, and this is also true if you've gone to certain community colleges or you transferred in from other colleges, you even learn about reversing entries, which are closing entries where you do one thing on the last day of the year and then literally directly the opposite on the first day of the following year, one day later. Um, and on the one hand, when you learn accounting that way, if it's all debits and credits and journal entries and T accounts, it can be easy to lose sight of the central purpose of accounting, which is it's all about value. The central foundational way to quantify account value, which is change in assets minus change in liabilities equals change in value. And it's also easy to lose sight over the two basic words that we usually use to connote any increase or decrease in value, which is revenue and expense. And so given the way that many students learned bookkeeping basically in 2301 to begin with, it can be real easy, very easy to lose sight of what revenue even means, sort of in a common sense way. But that is what we're referring to here. And accounting fundamentally is common sense, believe it or not, even though it may not feel that way all the time. Okay, but I digress. Other questions? Okay, so let me move on. Talk a little bit about our administrative plans. First of all, no class on Thursday. I'm actually working with Deloitte up at the National Training Center called Deloitte University. And so this is the second time I'm going up there. I probably could have taught the class from the hotel room on their corporate campus up there. But then again, Thursday was also, in a sense, a very early getaway day for spring break. And then I thought, okay, yeah, let's just cancel the class. So first and foremost, have a great spring break. It'll be my last time today to say that to you. Enjoy the break, and I'll see you Tuesday when we get back. In terms of what to expect when we get back on Tuesday, I'm going to begin chapter 11 today, which is the second half of fixed assets. And the last time that we chat about assets, because after we finish this chapter, it's on to liabilities. So I'll begin chapter 11 today. We'll complete chapter 11 the week we come back from spring break. We'll continue to basically, take quizzes, that cover what we discussed in class the last time that we met. I'll continue to yellow highlight the specific illustrations for you, as I have been doing. And finally, what I thought we would try is once we move on beyond chapter 11, so through chapter 11, we're starting it today. We'll finish it the week after spring break. We'll stick with what we're currently doing. But once I get past chapter 11, what I'd like to try to do is record sort of an introduction to each chapter and a high-ish level review of the illustrations to give those of you who want sort of a running start. So you'll be able to look at the recordings before we actually review the chapters in class. You don't have to do that, of course, because we still will not take our quizzes until after we cover each bit of material. But I think that might possibly be a nice way to begin our foray into recordings. As for where to actually upload the recordings to, I think I have a solution. It's non-traditional. I will say in passing, there are many students who think that your other teachers are uploading videos to Canvas or to Teams, and they're actually not. You know, they're actually using personal YouTube accounts and using links or embedding of videos and web and pages, etc., to get the job done. But anyway, that's what I am looking forward to. In terms of the automated approach, at this point going into this morning, I think I've had a total of 350 students use this automated approach thus far. That's excluding those of us who just took a quiz this morning. And there was only one example of Canvas possibly having a glitch. And the glitch was basically just getting access to begin with. So it wasn't anything that happened once a student was in the quiz using the automated approach. And since one glitch out of more than 300, which just involves Canvas, access to Canvas, is actually the kind of glitch probability that we'd probably face with any system. I do believe that it is a success. I'm sure you already felt that, and we'll continue along these lines. Next stop, if you will, video. Da, da, da. And again, we'll tackle that as soon as we complete the chapter that we're about to jump into. Okay, I know I saw one hand go up as I was rolling through that. So let me pause for a moment. Whoever that hand belonged to, I acknowledge I might have answered your question along the way, but let me pause for a moment. Any questions at all? Andrew, go right ahead.
Yes. So while we're still on the subject of announcements and quizzes and everything like that, because you mentioned last time that you may have a video for us to watch instead of a lecture attending this Thursday, and indeed class is canceled Thursday. So would coming back the Tuesday after spring break, would that quiz that we have be over the material we do today, or will it be over today and a possible video, or just a possible video?
That's a good question. So what I want to do is select the content that we haven't covered yet that best lends itself to what we would call an asynchronous learning approach, and that is not chapter 11. And so again, there are other chapters and other content in other chapters where simply watching a video and taking a quiz with perhaps a little bit of coverage by me should be appropriate. And as you might see today, what we're covering today, I think, doesn't necessarily lend itself to that. And furthermore, the most complicated aspects of chapter 11, which we'll cover after we get back from break, in my opinion, certainly does not lend themselves, to that kind of approach. So the bottom line is when I do that, if I do that, then it will be for certain very specific topics where I think I can easily say on a video, okay, here's an illustration or two. It's pretty much self-explanatory as it is, but let me walk through it. And oh, by the way, I completely agree with the textbook author. That doesn't happen everywhere. It's not quite going to happen in chapter 11. But I want to make sure that when I do that kind of learning activity, it's for the appropriate material. Andrew, makes sense? Sounds reasonable?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, sure. Okay, Lawson, I think I saw your hand go up for a moment, and yep, go right ahead.
So we do not have a class or quiz on Thursday, correct?
Correct. And the material from today's lesson, which we're about to start, will be covered the Tuesday we come back from spring break. So I think that's 2 weeks from today. Although honestly, who wants to think about coming back from spring break? If you allow yourself to do that for just a moment, that's when we'll take the quiz of today's material. Okay, other questions? Okay. Lawson, go right ahead.
So there won't be a virtual like class that we have to watch, correct? Over spring break, there won't be one.
There won't be one over spring break. The only thing I ask is that you enjoy spring break and whatever your plans are. And there will be some type of virtual learning activity later on this semester. But I'll cherry pick it to be as, relatively painless and straightforward as possible. I thought that was a fairer thing to do. Exactly. Okay, other questions? Okay, so let me share screen. And let me pull up the textbook. There we go. And here are the chapter 11 list of illustrations. And we'll begin with illustration 11-1, which you see on your screen right now. 11-1 says, I buy something that needs to be depreciated. It may be property, it may be plant, it may be equipment, maybe land, maybe building, anything whose value is going to be used up over time. It has a cost to acquire it to begin with, which is the value when you buy it. You pay cash for it. Cash goes down, in this case by $82,000. And the value of the asset goes up by $82,000. Now, one of the key issues of this chapter is that when you use it up, see, used up is literally the phrase that the textbook author uses. When you use it up, you may still be able to sell it and get something for it. The best example is when you buy a car and you bring it back to the dealer because it's basically old, and you tell the dealer, I still want a trade-in, and the dealer looks at your old car, which is pretty much all used up in terms of its usefulness, and the dealer says, well, okay, I'll give you a trade-in value of, $500, $1,000, $2,000, whatever it may be. That trade-in value is known as the residual value. And it sounds a little counterintuitive, but if you think used car trade-in, you'll see the logic. Residual, the English word residual, means what's left after something is used up. And so once you use up the value of a car, even though the words used up means or implies all gone, there is still some residual trade-in value that someone will give you, either because they think they'll be able to pull the asset apart and maybe sell it for parts, or there really is no value whatsoever, but they just want to incentivize you to buy the new thing from them. So they say, instead of giving you a discount, I'll just call it a trade-in value or a residual value. The bottom line, though, is that if you buy something for 82, 5 years later, you've used up its value, but someone's still going to give you 22 residual trade-in, well then, over the course of 5 years, if the value is going to go down from 82 to 22, you are using up 60 of value. And so the argument is every year for 5 years, actually every month for 5 years. Hey, you could even argue every day for 5 years. The value of 82 is going to come down little by little by little. And the value will come down over 5 years until by the end of the 5th year, it's only worth 22. Okay, questions about that? Okay. The rest of the chapter, I'm sorry, Andrew, go right ahead.
So how is this any different from regular depreciation? Like if I have something with a useful life of like 5 years and it costs $82,000 and what's left after the 5 years, maybe I'm not using my calculator, so I'm not like calculating it, but it's depreciated value after the end of 5 years, let's say 22,000. How is this different? It seems conceptually very similar.
It's actually identical. It is depreciation. However, the key question in this chapter is how do you depreciate it? Because there are different ways in which the value would go down over 5 years. So it is depreciation. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. But there are different ways in which you can try to reduce the value over a 5-year period. And in that, it becomes somewhat complicated. And actually, most likely, I'm going to spend the rest of the session just going through 5 or 6 different approaches or methods for depreciation. Some quite straightforward, and you've certainly seen them before, but there's a good chance that at least for some of these methods, you haven't seen them before. And that's, Andrew, that's where the difference is. It's the way that we're calculating depreciation. And they're all in illustration 11-3, well, 3 and 3A through 3E. So I guess, Andrew, that's a coming attraction. Hold that thought, because we're about to go into the details with, proverbially speaking, the devil being in the details.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Sure, sure. Okay, 11-3. We buy a machine for $250. We think that it's going to be worth 40 in 5 years. Well, right off the bat, you say, okay, then the value will go down, but from 250 to 40 over 5 years, it will use up or depreciate $210,000 worth of value over 5 years. Now, here's the first twist. We think over the 5 years, we will use the machine to produce 140,000 units of product of something. But that's just an initial estimate. It turns out that in the 5th and final year, when we think the thing is about to break down for good, it keeps going. And it produces 10,000 units more than we thought it would. And therefore, in total, it produces over the 5 years 150 as opposed to 140. Apparently, we thought it was only going to produce 16 in the 5th and final year, but it just keeps going. Now you say, okay, how much is this thing worth every year at the end of each year for the 5 years? What everyone learns, okay, right off the bat. And this is probably the one depreciation method that you have all seen, hopefully, is, well, okay, if this thing is going to lose $210,000 worth of value over 5 years, it's safe to assume that it will lose 1/5 of value, or 42,000 a year for 5 years. And so if at the beginning when I first buy it, it's worth 250, then at the end of that first year, it will be worth 250 minus 42, or 208. And then every year for 5 years, it's going to lose another 42 in value. So at the end of year 2, it will be worth 208 minus 42, or 166. At the end of year 3, well, in the third year, it will lose another 42 of value. So at the end of the third year, it will be worth 166 minus 42, or 124. The end of the fourth year, it'll be worth 124 minus another 42, or 82. And at the end of the fifth and final year, it will lose another 42 in value per year and be worth 82 minus 42, or 40. Wait, you might think, the end of the fifth year, shouldn't it be worth nothing? And the answer is no, because it has a residual value of 40. It may not be able to produce anything anymore, but you might still be able to trade it in for a trade-in value of 40, or maybe sell it for scrap of 40. What's the journal entry each year? Well, each year it's losing 42 of value. And so you can reduce the asset, credit the asset by 42. If an asset goes down in value, it reduces the value of the company. That is an expense. So you will see a credit to the asset and a debit to depreciation expense each year equal to 42. And that's what you see here. If you say, okay, I see the expense of 42, I don't see us reducing the asset. Yes, you do, because the phrase accumulated depreciation is a contra asset account. The textbook author just loves these contra accounts, but that is a negative asset account. Okay, so this should be the one type of depreciation that hopefully all of you have seen. Questions about this? Okay, when is this the type of depreciation you might choose? It's the type of depreciation you might choose for an asset that usually goes down in value by the same amount every year. And that's actually a little bit trickier than it sounds. I mean, you might say, well, if I'm going to use an asset every year, doesn't it always go down in value by the same amount every year over 5 years? And the answer is not at all. There are many, many, many assets that lose more value in the early years than the later years. And a primary example of that is a new car. If you go to an automobile dealership and you buy a new car and you spend, oh, what the heck, let's splurge, $100,000 on the new car. I know that's a lot, but it's a made-up example, so we can dream. You spend $100,000 on a new car. Guess what? Not only will that new car lose more value in your first year of ownership than your last year, but when you first drive the car off the lot in that first minute, it loses like $20,000 worth of value. New cars lose an unbelievable amount of money of value, not just in their first year that you own it, but like in your first month or first day, or even in the first minute. Now, why is that? It's because if you buy a new car, if you drive it home, maybe you only live a mile away. And let's say the next day you wake up and say, I've changed my mind. I'll drive it a mile back to the dealership and say I changed my mind. And let's say the dealer actually gives you your money back. Well, you've literally only driven it for 2 miles. I mean, people who take it out for a test drive probably drive it for longer than you did when you owned it. The problem is if they sell a new car and then accept it as a return, they can no longer sell it as new. They have to sell it as a used car, even though they'll do everything humanly possible to say, yes, it's used, but look how little it's been used. Yes, that's true. But there are just a bunch of people out there, a large part of the market, that don't want to buy any used car. They only want to buy something that is completely new. And so in that first year or first month or even first day that you drive a new car off the lot, it loses an awful lot of the value that you paid for it. And there are other examples, throughout the business world where you see that happening. Automobiles are just sort of the most common example where people experience that. For assets like cars, where this is the case, where more of the cost is used up in the early years than the later years, we call them accelerated methods of depreciation. What we mean by accelerated is, if you look at this middle column, over 5 years, you are still losing $210,000 of value, or using up $200,000 of value. It's just that you're not using up or losing the same amount of value each year. You are using up or losing more value in the early years than in the later years. Now, the textbook author happens to select in illustration 11-3b a calculation approach called double declining balance. We'll talk about that in the middle. We'll talk about that while looking at the middle, meaning middle column, in a moment. And then he gives you another example of an accelerated method where the early numbers are bigger in that middle column than the later numbers. Please note, this method is more accelerated than this method. This method has $100,000 of loss of value in year one. And actually, all of the value is gone by the end of year 4. There is no more value to be used up in year 5. Whereas in this method, sum of the year's digits, not 100, but only 70, is value used up in year 1. And we still have 14,000 of value being used up as late as year 5. This sum of the year's digits method is more gradual in terms of the acceleration of depreciation to the early years than this method. But we call both of them accelerated because they both have more depreciation, more loss of value in the early years than the later years. Okay, let me actually go through some of the year's digits first because it's closer to straight line. It's more gradual in the way that value is lost over the 5 years. Mechanically, this is the way that you compute the middle column. Middle column is the most important column here. Mechanically, you say this property is going to last 5 years. Okay, that means that I'm going to have a year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5. It's called sum of the year's digits because the first thing that you do is add up 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the sum of those numbers is 15. Then you say, okay, the denominator of this fraction is 15. The numerator in this fraction is, as I run down the column, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now note, if this was a property that would only last 3 years and not 5, then the denominator would be 1 plus 2 plus 3. The denominator would be 6, and the numerators would be 3, 2, 1. So the fraction varies based on how many years you're talking about. But the denominator is always the sum of these year's digits. And the numerator always begins with the number of the final year and always ends with the number 1. At that point, this middle column becomes easier to calculate. Okay, over 5 years, there's going to be a loss of value, a using up of value of 210. 5/15 of the 210 is used up in year 1. 4/15 of the 210 is used up in year 2, etc., down to year 5. 1/15 of the 210 is used up in year 5. And so you add up the amount of value lost each year, calculate it line by line by taking 210 and multiplying by these fractions, and you've computed the all-important middle column. How much value is my asset going to go down by in that year? If in year 1, we begin with an asset that's worth 250, and if under this method, the value is going to go down by 70, at the end of year 1, it will be worth 250 minus 70, or 180. If in year 2, the value is going to go down by 56, then at the end of year 2, the asset will be worth 180 minus 56 equals 124. Let's skip down a bit. End of year 4, the asset is worth 54. If in year 5 it loses 14 of value, then by the end of year 5, it will be worth 54 minus 14, or 40. Is 40 correct? Yes, it's the residual value. It's the trade-in value, or perhaps the scrap value. Okay, questions? Now, a different way of getting an even more dramatically accelerated approach to calculating that middle column, as we discussed, is something called double declining balance. The way that you compute the middle column here is take the number of years that you expect to have the property, 5, and then say, well, if I'm going to have a property for 5 years, if I was reducing the value by the same amount each year, I would be reducing the value by 20% per year. Let's just take the 20% and double it. That's why it's called double declining balance. Take the 20% and double it, and that gives us 40%. Each year, the depreciation expense for the year, the amount that the value will go down by, will be 40% of the value at the beginning of the year. So it begins the year worth 250. If it's going to lose 40% of its value during the year, it's going to lose 100,000 of value during the year. 250 minus 100, it will end the year worth 150. Okay, it ends year 1 at 150. It begins year 2 worth 150. If it's going to lose 40% of its value in year 2, 40% of 150 is 60,000. Well, if it begins year 1 worth 150, I'm sorry, if it begins year 2 worth 150, apologies. And if it loses 60 in year 2, then 150 minus 60 means it will end year 2 worth 90. Well, if it ends year 2 worth 90, then it will begin year 3 worth 90. If it loses 40% of its value in year 3, 40% of 90 is 36. Well, okay, if it begins year 3 worth 90, and if it loses 36 in value, 90 minus 36 is 54. It ends year 3 worth 54. It begins year 4 worth 54. And you might be tempted to say, okay, Mike, I get it. 54 times 40% is a largish number here. Okay, it's a little bit more than 20,000. Hold it, hold it. At this point, when the asset is worth 54, you cannot reduce its value by more than 14. Why? Because it has a trade-in value of 40. I mean, this is clunky. If it has a trade-in value of 40, the value can never go below 40. Even though 40% of 54 would bring you a higher depreciation number, that would, in your accounting, reduce the value below 40, but it can't go below 40. That's your trade-in value. Okay, then you are in your final year of reducing the value of the asset. You might have a lower than otherwise expected expense number because the value can never go below the residual value, the trade-in value, or the scrap value. Awkward and clunky, but it's just a different way to try to come up with a set of numbers in the middle column that illustrate the reality that for some assets, they lose more value in the early years than the later years. Questions? Okay, another thought. Now, I had said that you usually see accelerated depreciation happening for new cars because with new cars, there are a lot of people out there that will simply never buy a new car. the more expensive and luxury oriented the car, the more people will not want to buy it used. And the more accelerated the depreciation would be. So if you said, hey, Mike, I have two cars. One is a luxury sports car, a Lamborghini, and the other is a perfectly nice and quite valuable Lexus. Okay, also a luxury car, but it's no Lamborghini. They're both going to lose 210 over 5 years. But one of them is going to go down by $100 in value right away. And the other is only going to go down by 70 right away. Which of the two cars, the Lamborghini or the Lexus, the super luxury sports car or the sort of normal luxury car, luxury-ish car, is going to go down by more at the very beginning of its life? I would say that's the Lamborghini, because you do find people who are willing to buy a used Lexus. Not as much as the number of people who are willing to buy a used Kia, but they're out there. There are very, very, very few people who would buy a used Lamborghini. If you're going to buy that kind of car, you want to buy it new, unless you're a collector, of course. And so my point is, the more non-existent the market for used cars, the more accelerated the loss in value is going to be, because the more pronounced the effect of the car losing enormous amounts of value the moment it is no longer new. Okay, Lawson, I saw your hand up, but then you put it down. Go right ahead.
I think I figured out. I was confused on how we got the accumulated depreciation for 3B, but I think that it was just like you take the accumulated depreciation of 100,000 and then you'd subtract the depreciation expense to get the 160,000 and then keep on going down the line, right?
That's exactly right. The textbook author just loves his contra asset accounts as well as contra liability accounts. So I look at the book value column and I say, that's the value of the asset. And with every passing period, you reduce the value of the asset. What the textbook author is doing is saying, no, when you first buy something for 250, that asset just stays at 250 forever. Well, then how do you reduce its value if you never change the asset value of the asset? Well, the textbook author says, I will create a contra asset account. And so this right here, the accumulated depreciation, is a contra asset account balance that reduces the asset value to its book value. And I would not do that. I would just have one column, because it's simpler, called asset. It would begin year one worth 250, and then it would decline to each of these balances at the end of each of the 5 years. Okay, Lawson, was that helpful?
That was, but I'm still confused on the how we got the book value, the ending book value of the 250. I guess since that would be less of the accumulation, and that's accumulated depreciation, that's every time, right?
Okay, so I wouldn't look at the accumulated depreciation because it's a contra asset and it's not necessary. Book value end of year, that's the value of the asset. And so if an asset begins year one worth 250, and if it's going to lose 100 of value during the year, 250 minus 100 is 150. Well, if it ends year one worth 150, then it begins year two worth 150. And if it's going to lose 60,000 during year two, then at the end of year two, it'll be worth 150 minus 60 equals 90. So the book value end of year goes down every year by the annual reduction of value. You really only need column 3 to understand column 5. Lawson, was that helpful?
Yeah, now I got it. Thank you.
Sure. And if I was to have an accumulated depreciation column, I would actually, if I was the textbook author, shown those numbers as negatives. Because, you know, you look at the 250 here, and that's a positive asset. And then you look at these numbers. Well, 250 is a positive asset. It's what you paid for it to begin with. These are contra asset accounts. These are negative assets. So I don't even think this is necessary as a column, but if it was, if I was to show it, if the 250 is a positive number, then these should be negative numbers. Okay, so that's 11-3. You have another way of looking at these methods. You could say, for instance, hey, look, I'm going to use, at least I think I'm going to use, okay, coming all the way up here to the beginning assumption. I think I'm going to use this machine to produce 140,000 units. And so as each year goes by, if I'm producing 20,000 units with the machine in year 1, and if I think the machine is going to be used in total to produce 140, then during year 1, because I'm producing 20 out of the 140 I think it's capable of producing, during year 1, I am using up 20 1/40ths of its productive capacity. Then comes year 2. I'm actually using it in year 2 to produce 32,000 units. I still think in total, I'll be able to use it over its life to produce 140. Well, that means in year 2, as far as I know, I am using up 32 1/40ths of its productive capacity, and so on. And so if you go down to D, D is saying this. The way that I think about this, D is saying is, I'm going to have to use up $210,000 of value. That's this 210 right here over 5 years. I think at the very beginning and for most of the time that I'm using it, I will be able to produce 140,000 units. And so if I'm going to use up $210,000 worth of value over 5 years to produce 140,000 units, then every time I produce a unit, it's going to cost me $1.50 of value. Okay, let me pause for a moment and see if that is logical to you. Every time I produce a unit, I'm going to use up a certain amount of value. I'm going to produce, I think, 140,000 units over 5 years. And the total amount of value I'm using up is 210. Well, if over 5 years, I'm going to lose $210,000 of value to produce 140,000 units, then 210 divided by 140 is $1.50 per unit. Every time I produce a unit, I'm losing $1.50 of value. And let me pause. Does this little calculation make sense to you? If not, please ask a question. I'm spending or using 210 of value to produce 140 units. Thus, every time I produce a unit, I am spending or losing $1.50 of value. Okay. So that means that in a year one, that I produce 20,000 units, I am going to lose 20,000 times $1.50 per unit, or 30,000 of value. In year 4, I'm producing 28,000 units. I'm sorry, whoops, whoops. In year 4, I'm producing 28,000 units. That means the value of my equipment is going to go down by $1.50 times 28, or 42. Now, year 5 is a mess, because in year 5, you think after you produce your 140th thousandth unit, it's just going to break down for good. But it keeps going. And then it finally breaks down near the end of the year. So if you end year 4 or begin year 5 with the thing still worth 64, and if you know that at the end of year 5, you're going to sell it for its trade-in value or scrap value of 40, then actually, if it's worth 64 at the beginning of year 5, and if you're going to sell it for scrap or trade in for 40 at the end of year 5 is a special case. It almost doesn't matter how much you use it. You're going to lose 24 of value. And as the textbook author says, that's the amount that reduces the book value at the beginning of the year to what you'll actually trade it in for at the end of the year. Please note, in years like year 3, when you use it a lot, depreciation will be very high. In years like year 1, when you use it very little, depreciation will be pretty low. This makes more sense for the kind of equipment where the more you use it, the more it wears down. And the less you use it, the less it wears down. And if you don't use something at all in a particular year, it's worth exactly the same because you have not worn it down at all. So please keep in mind, straight line depreciation, losing the same amount of value each year, is usually used for something like a building. Doesn't matter if 50 people or 500 people are in the building today. That building is going to last for a certain amount of years. And it's going to lose, and the sun and the wind is going to wear it down by roughly the same amount each year. When you hear accelerated methods, think new cars. With a new car, there is more loss of value in the early years than the later years. And you would use more accelerated methods. Double declining balance is more accelerated than some of the year's digits. You would use more drastic accelerated methods for the kinds of cars where people really, 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 really don't want to buy used cars, which is why the value drops so precipitously in the first year. If, on the other hand, you're talking about a piece of equipment, and frankly, you're just using it, it's like a workhorse piece of equipment, and you're pounding away at it, In a year where you are pounding away at it a lot because you're using it a lot, it's going to lose more value. In a year when you hardly use it at all, you will hardly lose any value. For that type of equipment, units of production makes the most sense. And finally, 11E is not a new method. 11E simply summarizes the loss of value across each of the 4 methods that illustration 11-3 covers. And everything that I just said is summarized in 11-3. The total amount of value is still 210. Getting back to Andrew's point earlier today, it's still basically figuring out how to depreciate or reduce the value of the asset by 210 over a 5-year period. Straight line, same amount every year. Accelerated methods like double declining balance in some of the year's digits, it's called accelerated because the loss in value is greater in the earlier years and greatest in the earliest year. Double declining balance is even more accelerated than some of the year's digits. The greater the acceleration, the more the demand for what you're selling. In my example, luxury new car, and the less willing your customer base is to buy a substitute. In my example, used car. And the only method of the 4 where the dollar amounts are not the same over 5 years, they do not start high and grow progressively lower over 5 years, they bounce all over the place. That's units of production, because if you use it a lot, you depreciate a lot. If you use it, the asset, only a little, depreciation is only going to be a small amount. And so, and for certain types of assets, like pieces of equipment, a hammer, for instance, a hammer, you know, what you use to hammer nails, is going to wear out over time, but there will be more wear and tear during those years where you're hammering more nails. And in a year when you don't use a hammer at all, it probably does not lose its value at all. Okay, that concludes actually what I think of as sort of the core of this chapter. It's understanding that depreciation is doing the same thing in total, regardless of the method that you use, but also understanding that there are different methods to use, and the method that you select should reflect the nature of the asset that is being depreciated and how it naturally loses value over time. Okay, questions. Lawson, go right ahead.
So you said that the first method that we looked at 3A, we kind of would be used that to depreciate a building because it's going down steadily. And then the second one, we think about like a new car because it's accelerated. And then for the third method, was it that you kind of think about like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini because it depreciates even faster, or no?
So you're right, but you flip them. So if you look at what's on the screen, the second method is the more drastically accelerating. So year 1, it's losing $100,000 of value in double declining balance, whereas in year 1, the new car is only losing 70,000. So in my example, the Lamborghini would be double declining balance, whereas the Lexus would be some of the year's digits. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah, I see that now.
Okay, cool, cool. Okay, other questions? Going once, going twice, and hey guys, let me officially wish you all a wonderful spring break. Have a great time wherever you go. Do not worry about any kind of replacement class session for Thursday. Just enjoy spring break. We'll make it up while you return in a reasonable way. Class is officially dismissed, and I will, as always, stick around and answer sort of post-class questions. But once again, enjoy the break, everyone, and I shall see you in a couple of weeks. Okay, and with that, any conversational questions, post-class questions? Going once. Going twice. Going 3 times. And okay, I think it's partially due to the material being pretty straightforward, and maybe partially due to the fact that I mentioned spring break a few times. No questions at all. That's always fine. Guys, I'll shut down Zoom now. But again, thank you for hanging in there. Have a great break, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Take
Have a
care.
good spring break, Professor.
You too. You too.
Bye bye.
Bye bye now.